Most of the pastors I know feel really guilty about not replying on a Saturday when they get a message on a Saturday, or a Thursday night when they get a message on a Thursday night. What advice do you have for them about setting up boundaries and reasonable expectations when it comes to responding to inbound communication?
The general rule here is clarity trumps accessibility. So we think accessibility is what people want, right? In a lot of positions in which there's a client base, be it like congregants or a client for a business, we think what they want is the ability to get in touch with us at any time. What they really want is clarity. How do I get in touch with you and get an answer? So in the absence of clarity, where there's just a bunch of possible incoming channels, there's emails and phones and text, when they want to talk to you, they say, I guess in the lack of any other clarity, I want a response as quickly as possible so that I can take this off my to-do list. Like, okay, Carey, like, answer, good. Now we're going to meet then. Great. Now I can take this off my to-do list. But if there's clarity on here is how you reach me for certain things and how the planning process works, as long as it gives them that clarity, it's just as valuable as accessibility.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe because we drop all the episodes here. Hey, today it's Cal Newport. I'm so excited about this conversation. We did a deep dive. I talk about my own productivity challenges. He gives very specific advice to church leaders on what you need to do to make sure you're not on call 24/7 without disappointing everyone around you. And we talk about slow productivity. You're going to love this episode. Make sure you drop in the comments what you enjoy about it. We're really glad you've joined us. So, in the episode, Cal and I talk about training and how important it is. I pose to him the whole problem of preachers having to be up there every 7 days, and reps alone don't cut it. What he says is you need training in addition to reps. And I've got a special time-limited offer for you. Monday, March 11th, I'm doing a free live preaching accelerator. You can register at preachingworkshop.com. Just click the link. Love to see you there. I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do to improve your preaching, to make it more relevant, memorable, and helpful and engaging to the people that you serve. 10 proven steps. It's free Monday, March 11th. Also, Belay would love you to free up your time. They've got a free download for those of you who are watching on 24 things you can say no to grow your church. And you can get it by simply clicking the link or texting my name, Carey, to 55123. That's Carey to 55123. And now, a riveting conversation with Cal Newport. Cal, welcome back.
Oh, Carey, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, well, I've really benefited a lot from your work. I think the first time I discovered you was Deep Work, and it really impacted so much of how I think and how I live and how I've restructured my life. And since we last talked, which I think is a couple of years ago, there's been some pushback to the whole productivity optimization movement that you and I are a part of. And a lot of knowledge workers have subscribed to. What do you keep hearing, Cal?
Well, I call it the anti-productivity movement. And I think it really picked up speed during the pandemic. So the pandemic accelerated it, but it was certainly, I think, underway in the years leading up to the pandemic. I think, for example, Ginny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, was like an important kickoff of this sort of new wave of anti-productivity thinking. I really looked into it. I mean, I talk about in the book how I sort of investigated, especially among my own readers and listeners, hey, what's going on? And having these back and forth discussions, like where is the frustration here? And the best I can tell, what's really happening underneath this all is a growing exhaustion. So increasingly, when it comes to knowledge workers in particular, they're more likely than ever before just to be exhausted by the rhythms of their work, the quantities of their work. There's something about their jobs that feels like it's taking more from them than they actually want to give. And this is causing frustration. Then we get, in response to that frustration, a lot of different attempts to try to understand what's going on. And I think here is where we have a lot of partial truths, and someone might pick up one element but get another element wrong. Some people might be completely off the rails. The explanations for this feeling are varied, but I think what's homogenous is the underlying feeling of, why am I feeling more tired and exhausted and burnt out for my work than I remember feeling before? That's what's driving this right now.
Yeah, and I think that can be part of it too, right? If you're looking to optimize everything and be hyper productive. One of the big claims you made in deep work is that we really only have 3 to 4 hours of deep concentrated effort that we're capable of most days. For most humans, for most mere humans like you and me. It's like I was working on a new book this morning, and I got about 90 minutes into it, and I'm like, yep, that's good for today. I got 1,000 words, which is a lot for 90 minutes. But if I was up against the deadline, I guess I could have been going until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But quality, disappears. Yep. What do you think? Like when you look at that, do you disagree with the anti-productivity movement? Do you agree with them? What valid points do they have?
I mean, honestly, I think the anti-productivity movement's issue with productivity habits in the traditional sense of how am I organized, to-do list, what systems do I use? Their issue is not with the systems themselves. The claim, almost no one is making the claim that it's the productivity systems themselves is driving this sense of overload or this sense of exhaustion. The issue I think this movement has with those tools is that it's getting in the way of solving the problem. So they typically look and say there's these fundamental forces that are driving us to be more exhausted. You're just sort of giving into that reality if you're focusing on how to keep up. If you're just, okay, well then let me get my to-do list working better. Let me get my calendar better. You're just giving in to the inevitability of the system. And what you need to be doing is fighting the underlying forces itself. So a lot of the critique that you get from anti-productivity writers is you need to be on the side of some sort of resistance. And you're on the side of the proverbial aristocracy here if you're still just trying to figure out how to be more organized. I think that's what's really going on, which of course leads to lots of interesting contradictions, such as many of these writers who write about this also realizing I need to be more organized and caring about like what system should I use. But I've come to believe the real issues here are, to some sense, orthogonal to organizational habits, orthogonal to how we organize ourselves. So I sort of agree with them that there's a deeper issue. I often disagree, however. So where I disagree with a lot of members of this movement is that they tend to think that the issue driving this is just an amplification of standard labor politic type structures, that you have exploitative managers trying to exploit their workers. And like in sort of a classic Marxist analysis, they will just continue to exploit as much as possible till you revolt and push back. I tend to have a more real think, nuanced view of what's driving this that has to do more with the incoherent ways in which we define productivity and the unexpected consequences of introducing new technologies into this world. So I tend to come at these issues as a technologist from the impact of tools on the world. I think we stumbled more into this current world of exhaustion than we were tricked into it or pushed into it by an exploitative managerial class. And it's there where I tend to not see eye to eye with a lot of the elite anti-productivity movement. I don't see this as exhaustion as an issue of late stage capitalism. I see exhaustion as an issue of we never really define what productivity means, and then we introduce Slack. And those two things coming together blew up the world of work. I like to be in the trenches observing how people actually work, what's actually causing their issues. And the answers often turn out to be way more pragmatic and weird and practical than the grand theory of just a cultural critic writing on Substack is probably going to come across.
So I'd love to use you as a little bit of a case study, because if you think about your last decade, your world looks radically different than it did a decade ago. I mean, you had couple of New York Times bestselling books come out. You started a podcast. Did you start that during the pandemic? Was that a 2020 thing?
Yeah, like half the podcast out there was a 2020 project.
Exactly. But you've kept it going, unlike a lot of people. And then you just recently added video. You and I were commiserating about video. Like I just redid my studio. We've got phase 2 with better lights coming in, et cetera. But it just seems like everything is stacking on top of the other. You know, there's more books that you're publishing. You did an audio podcast, which is relatively easy, but add video into it. As you said, when we're chatting, it just adds a layer of complexity to it. So you probably felt the tendency to just keep stacking your work hours higher and higher. What are some key challenges you faced over the last decade in managing your expanding kingdom, empire? I don't know what you would call it. And then how have you pushed back and kept it reasonable so that you can still see your family, and still you're a professor too. That's what it's easy to forget. It's like, no, you have a day job and this is all on the side. Can you give us a little synopsis of what that last decade has looked like for you, Cal, personally?
Well, I mean, it's exactly these issues that pushed me to be interested in this topic. So, I am actually experiencing the same things that other people are experiencing. And unlike other people, I can actually go out and say, well, let me write a book about how to solve this. Like, let me use a book as an excuse to research and figure out what's going on and come up with a solution. But for me, I would say the big turning point in the last decade was when my three kids, I have three boys, when they all recently made it to elementary school age. And it's a really different phase of parenting than toddlers and babies. When your boys get to elementary school age, what I began realizing is that they essentially needed every single minute I could give them. Like, it was a linear dose response, right? More minutes is always better than less, and there's really no cap to it. So that put me in this interesting situation where, okay, it wasn't just I need to make sure I'm doing what my toddlers and babies need and like what my wife needs so she doesn't go insane, and that they get their sleep and they get to like where they need to go. Now there is this direct conflict between I'm reaching the height of my powers, my professional skills. The opportunities are limitless. And at the same time, my family needs every minute I can give them. And these two are in tension. And for me personally, from there, that's where I hatched this question, to which slow productivity is the answer, which is, how can I still do work that I'm really proud of and uses these skills that I have developed and allows me to support my family without burning out, without letting work basically take over most of my time? So that was my personal introduction to this question. And then at the same time I was grappling with this is when the whole anti-productivity movement arose, and essentially everyone else began grappling with the same question as well. People were really burnt out from their work. They were feeling this tension between life and work that got way worse for knowledge workers during the pandemic. Most people weren't on board with the anti-productivity solution of like, let's just like revolt against capitalism. Like, that didn't seem like this was going to be a reasonable resolution in the near future to their problems, because they still wanted to do work. They are ambitious. They want to do their job well. So they were feeling this tension, and they don't want to just do sort of theoretical frameworks about like how we're going to overthrow the economy. So everyone was in the same place I was in. I think we were all feeling the same thing. I care about my work, but also I want to spend a lot of time with my family. How do I make both of these things square? That's what led me to this idea of we have to rethink productivity. And so the secret reason for a book on slow productivity, it was in some sense, a personal manifesto, as much as it is a work of cultural critique or advice. How am I, in the years going ahead, going to deal with this problem of having a lot of professional opportunities and abilities, and also having three young boys that need all of my time? How am I going to reconceptualize work in a way that's going to allow me to do both of those things? What's the right way forward? That was a real driving force for me.
How many times in a year, a decade, a multi-year period do you find that you have to recalibrate the system that you teach? What are you discovering about that? Are you constantly tweaking as you add things? And yeah, I think a lot of leaders can relate to that.
It's a combination of two opposing forces, right? So one thing that has surprised me is that a lot of the themes that emerge in my work were there very early. Like, if you go back to my very early work, I was writing for students. My first 3 books were aimed at students. When I started my blog, this was 2007, it was aimed just at students, right? And so you would think that must be very separate from slow productivity now, 15 years later, what have you. But for a while, what'd you call it, like motto or description of my blog, the catchphrase was essentially do less, do better, know why. And that's more or less the 3 principles of slow productivity in this book coming out in 2024, which is do fewer things, work at a natural pace, and obsess over quality. And so even when I was dealing with students, so back then the big issue was I was dealing with college students who were overwhelmed and stressed out, very ambitious students, and they were getting crushed by school. I was writing a lot about that. I used to actually give talks around the country to college students about stress and how to deal with it. Back then, the germ of my response has germinated into something much bigger today. It's like, well, yeah, you do fewer things. You need to have a more natural pace, obsess over quality. It's like really knowing why you're doing it and really having respect for what you're doing. So in some sense, the basic ideas stick around. At the same time, there's a lot of every 5 years, there's some other new twist or obstacle that I didn't see before because it wasn't there that I have to deal with. So that's why, I write deep work. Comes out in 2016, but I'm writing down 2015, and I'm talking about the value of concentration. By the time that book comes out, people are saying the big thing that matters here is we can't do deep work because email's out of control, Slack's out of control in a way that it wasn't before. So I write another book in 2021 about why did email or Slack get out of control. It wasn't like that when I first started writing business books. So we have this Digital Minimalism, my book in 2019. I didn't really plan to write that next. That book was supposed to be my follow-up to deep work, but this discontent with distraction from digital devices exploded in 2016, 2017. And so I turned on a dime and said, this is what I need to tackle. So it's a combination of there's some deep themes. Don't do too many things. Do the things you do really well. You got to give yourself a pace that's reasonable. Those have been there from the beginning. But the specific obstacles that arise, the email is a problem, a smartphone with social media, this didn't exist when I wrote my first books. The obstacles keep being new. So I think it's a tension between what's always been there and what is changing every 5 years.
When you think about the expansion of your universe over the last 5 years, you added a podcast, audio first, easier to do. Then you added video. Your books keep selling. You wrote a new book. You're back to class again when the pandemic ended. What did you cut, or how did you manage it so that the work didn't become all-consuming?
There are two things I did. So one is for what I think of as the media company, aspect of my career, which is the podcasting and the video surrounding the podcasting. I made a rule, 1/2 day per week. It has to fit into 1/2 day per week. If I want to do more, I have to figure out how to take what I'm already doing and reduce that footprint, right? So when I was first doing the podcast, I was just me and I was doing it twice a week and I was doing all the stuff on the computer, this or that. And I wanted to expand into video, etc. And so I ended up having to hire a producer and say, okay, you are going to touch the computer. I'm not going to touch the computer. So I can just come in and record. And we're going down to 1 day per week. This allowed us then to think more about video. This took a long time for me to get in the video, though. I had to hire someone to come set it all up. There's a lot of misses here because I was going slowly. It had to fit into this 1/2 day a week. And now we have a YouTube person to handle that, so I don't have to do it. So I just have a rule. It's a 1/2 day per week. And it's growing, and it's grown very well, but probably grown a lot slower than if I had just gone all out. But of course, when people go all out on something new, you burn out and it takes away time from other things. So I think that's important. The other big change I've made is as my academic career continues to mature, I'm increasingly steering it towards what I'm doing with my writing. So, back when I was writing deep work, I was an assistant professor, computer science, still aiming for tenure. Anyone who's in academia in a science knows none of the books I was writing would have anything to do with tenure. It couldn't matter less. Tenure is letters, confidential letters from leaders in your academic field, giving frank assessments of your research. That's all that matters, right? So as hardcore computer scientists writing 4 to 5 papers a year, post-tenure, post-deep work, that's begun to change. Georgetown, where I work, has developed an interest in digital ethics, being at the forefront of understanding the impact of technology on society. They have deep connections, of course, to policy and Congress. They also have deep humanist connections because it's a Jesuit university. And I really leaned into that. And so now I'm one of the founding faculty members of the Center for Digital Ethics at Georgetown. I'm the inaugural director of a new academic major, Computer Science, Ethics, and Society. And I'm increasingly moving what I do away from computer science that's unrelated to my writing and say, no, more and more of my writing is about technology and how it impacts us. Even slow productivity, the story underneath there is a story of technology upsetting what work meant. That's the instigation for this book. And so increasingly the writing I'm doing, my books, my New Yorker writing, even my podcast, I'm saying, yeah, this is part of my role as a professor in the same way that, Carl Sagan doing Cosmos was related to the fact that he was an astronomy professor, or how Richard Dawkins evolved into a chair that was in the public understanding of biology. And so his books and what he was doing was not on the side, but became more critical. So I'm melding those two worlds together. So my academic and writing career are focused on the same thing. And I had to do these things. You can't, if I had just blindly kept being a computer scientist, spent a huge amount of time on doing podcasting and videos, if I wasn't being careful about this, I think I would have drowned.
For all of the young leaders listening who maybe don't have a team or can't afford, an editor, et cetera. And by the way, my approach to podcasting when I started almost a decade ago was identical to yours. I knew my superpower, if I had one, I wasn't sure I did, was going to be the quality of the relationships that I build with the guests and the guests that I can get, and then my ability to really focus on the substance of the show. And since episode 1, once it's Dropboxed, I don't touch it again. Like basically there's no buttons. I'm the content guy. And we hired around that, but not everybody can do that. So if you think back to Cal 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when you were younger and just starting out and didn't have your deep work portfolio to rely on, what were you doing then that you no longer do now? If people are looking for things to cut, where is some low-hanging fruit so that they could focus better and not be working 70, 80 hours a week?
So if we're thinking like pre-deep work, but maybe me as a young professor.
Yeah. In
like,
other
why don't
words,
we use that? Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great, because I'm sure you were doing things then that you're no longer doing. And by that, I mean topics or ideas or like things you were interested in. And then very practically, now I get my groceries delivered. Before I used to go grocery shopping 2 hours a week, whatever that happens to be.
Well, I mean, in that early professor stage, I was writing a ton of papers, right? So I got tenure early at Georgetown. And you do that. So after 4 years instead of 5 to 7 years. And that's because I was publishing a ton. I was sort of publishing my butt off, traveling a lot to present those papers, right? So I was doing what you would do with a newly minted doctorate from MIT in computer science. You're a publishing machine. So I was writing a ton of papers all the time. Also, I had babies at home. So that was also a big part of what I was doing. I wasn't actually writing that much. I mean, there's a pretty big gap. There's a 4-year gap between So Good They Can't Ignore You and the follow-up book, Deep Work. So So Good They Can't Ignore You came out in the fall of 2012 in September. In November of that year, I had my first kid. So there's a reason, right? There's 2 kids between So Good They Can't Ignore You and the Deep Work, the book that followed. So I was wrangling babies, right? And I had a lot. It was just the reality of my work was more flexible than my wife's. So there's a lot of time at home, childcare bridging, and I was writing a lot of papers. So that was taking up all of my time. So in some sense, what I'm doing now is, well, I don't write a huge number of computer science papers, and I don't have babies to take care of. I have kids that get on a school bus and they go to school and they're at school all day until they come home. Like that time pressure has been released. And so now you see I'm able to add something like podcasting and video back into my rotation. In some sense, it's able to fill in time on what I was doing before. So it's not that I was doing a ton. I was working many more hours back then. I've always been very selective. So I've just changed what my limited amount of time goes towards, because I was always a big believer in what I called fixed scheduled productivity, which is fix how long you want to work. That's the rule. And then you work backwards from that constraints to make it work. So at that stage of my life, if I'm following fixed scheduled productivity, I don't want to work into the night or early in the morning. I couldn't do much more than take care of babies and just do my core thing of writing papers. And then once those things loosened, I could put something else into that time. So I changed what I focus on, but I've actually kept pretty consistent throughout my whole career, this idea of this is how much I work. The game is what can I fit into that time? And the answer to that question is going to be different depending on, what stage of life you're in. But I never accepted as a possibility the 80-hour work week or I'm just going to do a second shift at night, or I'm going to get up early. I always work backwards from my work has to fit in reasonable hours, and I will be incredibly innovative. I'll become popular worldwide as a productivity expert, in part because I'm just trying to figure out how do I make more work fit into this limited time. That was always a standard I had.
I think that's so liberating for young leaders. I talk to young leaders all the time and they're like, how do I write a book? I'm 28 or I'm 32. And I'm like, do you have kids? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, whoa, hold your ambition for a minute. Like, I hadn't published my first book till I was 40. And I mean, kudos to you and to so many others who went earlier, but there's a lot of life on the other side of frenetic stages as well. So I think you just gave people permission to breathe a little bit and realize it doesn't always have to happen now. Let's define pseudo-productivity. I thought that was such a fascinating concept, Cal. I love it. What is pseudo-productivity?
Well, this gets back to my more complicated explanation of why we're all exhausted right now. So this is my analysis from the first part of the book, is I said, here's what happened. Productivity for a long time was really clearly defined. It emerged as a concept in agriculture. How many bushels of crops do I produce per acre of land? You could measure that. You knew exactly how you were doing crop rotation. So you could say this way of planting generated this metric, and I changed it this way of planting. I produced more bushels per acre. That way is better. That concept of productivity carried over to industrial manufacturing, where now we could measure labor hours per product produced. So we could say, for example, Henry Ford could look at the assembly line and say this reduces the labor hours per Model T by a factor of 10. The assembly line is better than the way we were doing it before. Things get more productive. Mid-20th century, knowledge work, in which now we're not planting things or building things with our hands, but adding value to information using our minds, that emerges as a major economic sector, first in the US and then other worldwide beyond that. We didn't have the ability to easily port this very common notion of productivity, which had been around for centuries. We could not port that onto knowledge work. In part because we don't just do one thing in knowledge work, we do a dozen different things. And what I'm working on is different than what you're working on. It's unclear to measure exactly what we're producing. And also in part, there's no clear systems. The way I organize myself and my time is different than the way you organize yourself and your time. So there's no knob we can tweak and then say, did this make us more productive? Great, let's do things this way. It's autonomous and haphazard. So we didn't have a reasonable definition of productivity in knowledge work, but we needed something to manage people by. It couldn't just be a free-for-all. So what we came up with was pseudo-productivity, which is just a heuristic that says visible activity we will use as a proxy for useful action. So if I see you doing things, that's better than not seeing you do things. Doing more things is better than not doing things. It's obviously not a super precise way of measuring output or productive output, but it's the best we had. So pseudo-productivity, starting in the mid-20th century, implicitly became what we meant in knowledge work when we said productivity. Action's better than non-action. More is better than less. That's the way we have been thinking about productivity and knowledge work. And my whole thesis is that kind of worked for a while until we got portable computing, until we got the internet, until we got networked front offices. And then that definition blew up. And that's my claim for what happened is the collision of pseudo-productivity with modern digital office. When those two came together, that's when things started going off the rails, leading us to our current state of exhaustion right now.
I asked a few friends for some questions they might want to pose to you. And one of my friends said, why is it that we equate accomplishment with meaning? In other words, and I think this falls into the pseudo-productivity trap. I am what I do. I am what I produce. And perhaps I am how busy I appear or how many hours I work. What do you think the temptation is with accomplishment and equating that to meaning?
Well, here's the trap I see there. Not necessarily finding meaning in accomplishment, because we're wired for that. We're wired to feel good when we generate a plan using the long-term planning systems in our brain, and we execute the plan. And then in the end, we see this plan that we judge to be good, completed. We feel good about that. And so we know that from a neuroscience perspective. We also know this from a philosophical perspective. Clearly, we know this from a theological perspective. I mean, there's no way to read the first chapter of Genesis, for example, without that idea being everywhere. And he looked at it and said it was good. God created this and then said, this is good, right? So that's natural. Where this becomes a problem is when pseudo-productivity enters the scene. Because pseudo-productivity, again, is this heuristic we came up with when managerial capitalism inventing it. It was like, yeah, activity is better than less. So it's pseudo-productivity that began to associate busyness, activity, with work. And so the problem, I think, is when we keep this idea that accomplishment gives us meaning, but we swap out actual hard work on something important for busyness, because that's what pseudo-productivity tells us work is. That's the disconnect that's a problem. So then we think we need to be busy to have meaning because we have mixed a deep philosophical theological idea of making our intentions concrete, manifest concretely in the world with this heuristic of busyness is the same as work. And we put those two together and that chimera is terrible for us. And so now if we associate busyness with meaning, this is a problem because we have an age of mobile computing, we have laptops, we have smartphones and the internet. There's always more work we could do. There's no limit on busyness. And then we put ourselves into this terrible sort of constant battle internally between at any moment I have to decide my family, something else, work. This thing that's important to me, work. We are constantly now in that battle because the work is with us everywhere. And pseudo-productivity says, hey, doing more makes you better at your job than doing less. And so we constantly have to fight this battle now. I think, and again, that's the tension that I think that's causing all the discontent we have right now. Is just that we have to constantly be in this battle between more work or other things that are important. Pseudo-productivity is the problem. That is what is distorting our notion of meaningful accomplishment. That is what is making work become this thing that follows us everywhere and drags down on our subjective experience, makes everything a little bit more stressful, more anxious. Pseudo-productivity, I think, is the villain here, much more so than the desire to accomplish something.
One of the battles I fought in my own life, and I have more than a few friends who are struggling with this right now, is we don't know what to do with ourselves if we're not busy. If we're not checking our devices, if there's not some project to work on. And again, if you've got really young kids, take a pass on this for a few years because you are busy as long as you're awake. But, I'm at the empty nest stage of life. I've been there for almost a decade now. So, a decade. And it's amazing how much time you have. And it was a real detox for me to be comfortable just reading a book that isn't tied to work, or something I'm doing, or taking a long walk with my wife and not worrying about when I'm getting back, or going skiing for a Friday afternoon and not thinking that I was cheating somehow. That is really difficult for us. Any comments or thoughts for leaders who are struggling with that sense that they just cannot not be busy producing something?
Oh, it's really hard when you've been swimming in pseudo-productivity. It is hard when you get out of those waters. I just did a question on my podcast in a recent episode that I thought was really, really interesting because it was like a natural experiment. So he was a developer, I think. He was used to busyness, right? And then he goes to a company that had essentially taken all the ideas from my recent books and put them into action to get rid of busyness, right? Email, Slack, all that was gone. They had this very good system of like you work on one thing at a time. Questions are asynchronously posted. There's almost no meetings. There's no inboxes to check. You just work on the thing you're working on. And it really, really threw him for a loop. Because what was happening is, you can do 3, maybe 4 really good hours of work a day on something. And he didn't know what to do with himself. And it made him very uncomfortable. So then he was trying to take this really hard work and stretch it to the same hours that the busyness filled before. And it was completely frying his brain, right? You can't do that. No one can do that because he was very uncomfortable with, I need to be doing stuff all day. And really the answer for him was, hey man, your workday just got slashed in half. Like, that's good news. Like, let's go work on a hobby, because what you were doing, we're going to fill 8 hours with activity. It's what I call the invisible factory model in my book, because it's just taking the factory model of shifts and moving it to knowledge work. Only works in pseudo-productivity. Because then okay, I have to be here 8 hours. I can fill this with stuff. There's always emails to answer and Zoom calls to jump on or what have you. When you get rid of the pseudo-productivity, why do I need 8 hours? Why is that number right? Most days it's probably 3 or 4 unless there's something else going on. So it can be hard. But it's one of the reasons why I'm arguing that the most important of the three principles in my book is actually the third one, which is called obsess over quality. The first two are about directly dealing with workload and timing. Do fewer things, work at a natural pace. Take longer, have more variation, take more breaks. The third one is about quality, obsessing over quality. Why is that important? Well, because the other ones are going to lead you to confusion and anxiety unless you do the third, unless you teach yourself to really identify and begin to obsess about what you do best, to get meaning in the craft of your main thing you produce. Once you really obsess over the quality of what you do, maintaining fewer things on your schedule, working at a more natural pace, all that's going to follow along naturally because it serves this bigger goal of I want to do what I do best well. So you have to focus on becoming comfortable with doing something really well before you can expect to be comfortable not doing that many things. So it's a really good comment because a lot of people really do struggle. You can't just go from pseudo-productivity to quiet because if you've been raised on pseudo-productivity, that's equivalent to just being lazy. So I think obsessing over quality is really the best way to burst out of pseudo-productivity and say, this is nonsense. This isn't producing more value. It doesn't make me more useful to the world. This is really useful what I'm doing. And to do this well, I got to get this other stuff out of here. And suddenly pseudo-productivity seems not at all rational.
So we're going to get to the principles of slow productivity, which I found really, really helpful. But if you're up for it, I'd love a little bit of case study and some free therapy, if that's all right, Cal. So yesterday, I want to use myself as a case study. You were kind enough to endorse my last book, At Your Best, where I took some of the ideas in our space and shared how they worked out in my life and divide, your workday into 3 zones: green, yellow, red. Green, high energy, your time block where you're super creative, dialed in. Red being you're exhausted, need a nap, need some caffeine, which I think all of us have a couple hours of those a day. And then yellow, everything in between. And I argue that leaders, as you do, Cal, should do what they're best at when they're at your best. If you're a morning person, do your writing in the morning. If you're a night owl, do it at night. That's great. I'm a morning person. But in a case of physician heal thyself, I found myself getting into this very uncomfortable creep of other things interfering with my green zone. I moved my workouts to the morning because I had started a new program. That meant I wasn't getting to the office as early, office being literally another room in the house, as early as I wanted to or had done in the past. So yesterday, I took a day offline, got rid of all my devices, went analog, set up myself a series of maybe 20 or 30 questions, prayed through it, thought through it, and came up with a radical re-altering of my workday. Not unfamiliar. I've written about this. I've read your stuff. This is not like, oh my gosh, this is a new breakthrough. It was a new application. So basically, I'll give you and I'd love you to critique it, comment and critique. So what I decided, because I haven't written a book in 3 years and I want to write a book, but the time was disappearing. I'm on the road a lot. Long story short, 6 to 7 a.m., get up, do my workouts in the afternoon. So I'm going to do them at 4:30 in the afternoon now. They go back there. I'm not trying out for a sports team. So we're just going to put them later in the day when I'm not at my best. 6 to 7 a.m. personal time. I do a prayer and devotion every morning, get showered, get ready for the day. 7 a.m. at my desk, no devices, no task switching, as you talk about in a world without email and digital minimalism and the cost on that. So it's as analog as possible. Start writing and do things that create, basically the creative sphere. If I need an idea, if I'm writing, if I'm doing a first or second draft, if I'm preparing a new talk, that goes in the first 2 hours at 9 o'clock. Then I switch to a lighter green zone where I'm editing. I'm editing my newsletter. I'm recording intros and extras for podcasts, not doing the deep work of thinking of the questions or that. Yep. But these are things that might be called shipping. So the first 2 hours is creating. The second 2 hours is shipping, getting stuff ready to go to market, the finishing touches, but it doesn't require as much brain power. And then at 11 o'clock on, everything else, whether that's meetings or whatever. My team still needs permission to put anything in my calendar before noon. But beyond that, I can do coaching calls, I can do interviews, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I'm 1 day into this experiment. All right. So you're talking to me. I did that this morning. Cal, I got 1,000 words written, the most I've done in 6 months. Any thoughts about, and then a last meeting, the other change I made to my team, because work does need a definite ending. Last meetings are at 3:00 every day. That's it. It's just now, most of those will be done at 3:30 or 4. On podcast days, they go till 4:30. Then I'm off the clock. And then I know I'm going to have that slot to get my workout in or my bike ride in or that kind of thing. So that's prescriptive. I work for myself, right? But if you're in a lead seat, you can have that kind of freedom and flexibility. Thoughts or critiques on that reboot for someone who had to go heal himself again?
Well, there's a lot I like, right? This is a classic slow productivity configuration. And then I'm going to throw out a potential even next step, Reboot 2.0. All right, first of all, I like moving the workout to the end of the workday. I did the same thing recently. I think people really underestimate this move because what it does is, I don't know if you have the same experience, it's a great transition from work to non-work. I do it right before dinner. It's a great transition, right? 30, 40 minutes of you're doing like purely physical work completely changes your mode. It gives you a burst of energy. I think it's a great way to transition out of work. It also makes sense to exercise before you eat, right before you eat, because, hey, there's, the protein you need, because, you and I, of course, are like bodybuilding. So
of course we are. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're pounding weights in the gym and trying to grow our traps or whatever.
Schwarzenegger.
We're basically Schwarzenegger. Yeah. No, so I like that. I like that idea. Green zone in the morning, I think, is fantastic, right? Especially the tweak to that, no devices till that zone is over. Typically, when people try to do this, the biggest trap, let's say if I'm going to first thing when I start my work in the mornings, I'm going to write or work on whatever I do best, is they will fall into email or Slack, not because there's something urgent, but because what they want to do is hard. And it's easier. You're like, this is easier. And then they throw the whole thing off. So having a hard and fast rule there is really good. I like that as well. And it's simple that people know, don't expect to hear from me until after I'm done with that. All that's great. Clean shutdown time is great. I think all of that is really good. My Reboot 2.0 is that this also sets you up. This configuration sets you up as you might think it's important, and it might not be, to do more radical reductions, because now you're doing your most important stuff first thing in the morning. And then everything else is like, okay, here's what comes next. You can start now that that's isolated, thinking about, how do I slow down the pace of this stuff that comes next? If you need to. But let's say you're still feeling overwhelmed by work. Now you have a clear target. And now you could deploy, for example, seasonality on various scales. So let's say, and you don't feel this way, but if you'll say you're still feeling, I'm overwhelmed by work still, I'm feeling a little bit exhausted. You could start doing seasonality on the weekly scale and saying, okay, I'm going to do coaching only on Fridays. What would that require? Well, I might lose this many clients, but I could have a good roster on Fridays. And then it doesn't intersperse with the other days. Wow, that feels kind of relieving. Okay, then maybe I do the podcast work on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Now, Monday and Thursdays, I don't do anything with podcast. Then when you're thinking about speech preparation, maybe you go up to a higher seasonality, something I do, for example, and I don't give talks during this season. This season I do. So like in the summer, I don't give talks. So like now I have a lot of days in which I'm done at noon, I'm done at 1. Different days are different. So it really, when you isolate your light green, yellow zones from the really deep green zones, it's much easier to start playing with workload and pacing, because you still have this foundation of the core stuff I'm doing first thing in the morning and doing really well. And that's really what's supporting me. And everything else is built on top of that. I have a lot more flexibility. I might as well change, once I have the foundation set, I can change the architecture of the building on top of it to be something I find to be more appealing. So I like that you're also setting yourself up to make those changes in a way that's much harder when it's all mixed together. You're like, I don't know, all this stuff seems kind of important. I don't know how to change one thing or if it'll really make a difference.
I really appreciate that. A quick footnote on the workout. So part of the reason I did it is I was so tired by 4:00 most days that I didn't have the energy for it. And I'm like, okay, that's solvable. Another reason is Arthur Brooks was on a few months ago. He talked about working out hard first thing in the morning. Then he goes to Mass. He's Roman Catholic. And then he starts work. And I have actually implemented that process, not going to Math, but starting with a hard workout. The other thing I did with my Bible, because I use an iPad and YouVersion, I went and grabbed the Bible from the shelf, printed out my reading schedule and my prayer list, and now it's all analog. So you're right. I am as guilty as anybody else. You tempt me with Slack or email or text messages that came in overnight, and if I'm on an electronic device, I'm going to fall to that. And so now it's gone. The devices are asleep until 9 o'clock. So there's that. So I'm flipping. And then Craig Rochelle too, I'm pretty sure he still does his workout, and he is like super, super fit at 3:30 as a break between the end of the day and the evening when he goes home. So that's just a note to those of you who are taking notes and who have followed stuff on that. I guess the other thing that and I was going to ask you this later, because you're right about everything else just creeping up and being so busy. So one of the hardest live leadership lessons I have right now is learning how to say no. And every year it gets difficult. I've written about this. I've studied the theory about it. You must have that too. 10 speaking invitations for everyone that you choose to accept. And I'm finding that the criteria is always changing. So I created yesterday, we'll see how this works in real time, a new, what I call A-level yes filter. If I'm going to say yes, these 4 conditions have to be true. What advice do you have for leaders who are really struggling with how to say no?
Yeah, and it's a common problem. And there's a few different things here that are relevant. One, which I think people overlook, is remove more categories of things just entirely from your life. I don't give speeches anymore. I don't do mentoring coffees. Just take whole categories off of your plate makes a big difference. And then it's like, I just don't do those anymore. Like, you don't have to actually have the back and forth. There's only so many things you can do. There's already a lot of things you implicitly just don't do. Adding more to that list is not as big or dramatic as a change as people think. All right. Then when it comes to things that you do some of, I think something like you're talking about is smart. Have some clear filtering rules. Another thing to add there potentially is quotas. All right, I do this. I need to do this as part of my work, but I only do 3 per month. And that gives you a really clear excuse. If someone's like, well, can you just jump on, like for a professor paper reviews as an example of this, you say, hey, can you do this review? And you're like, I love doing reviews. And I've done a lot of reviews for your publication. However, I've already hit my quota for the semester, so I can't do this review. I've already hit my quota for the semester. That works well because it's hard to argue back. To argue back, someone has to say your quota's wrong. It should be bigger.
Yeah.
And they don't know. Like, okay, you've thought about this. You've hit your limit. You seem like you've thought more about this than I have. It's much better, by the way, than just saying like, I don't know, I'm busy, because from their mind, the problem they're trying to solve is to get someone to do something. So they will always answer back like, yeah, I know we're all busy, but thanks for agreeing to do this. They're going to give it to you anyways. No one is ever going to volunteer the no for you. And then the third thing is you have to be super clear with the no's. This was a huge lesson I learned. You have to say right up front, no, I cannot do this. Then you can be nice, but don't be nice in the no. Be nice in what you say after you say no. You're not, as we just said, you're not going to lead someone who wants you to do something to saying no on your behalf. So don't be like, well, I have all these things going on, and just hope they volunteer. Wow, you really seem busy. How about you don't do this? Now you got to just be clear.
Yeah, no one's going to say that.
Or if you say like, I don't know, like, yeah, I can't really come on this show. I don't know, that week you're talking about, it's like really busy. I have a lot going on this semester. But you leave it there. They'll say, okay, well, we'll just do it later. Okay, fine, when the semester's over. So it's really important to say, unfortunately, and have a good word like unfortunately, I can't accept this. And then you can give some reasons. It's just I've reached my quota, or I'm having to say no. I'll often say things like, I'm in monk mode. I'm switching over to monk mode because I'm working on a new book, and so I'm not really doing a lot of this right now. But I always have the really clear no. So that matters as well, right? So we have take whole categories off your plate. Almost everyone's doing too much, and the reason why leaders do this is that they imagine an opportunity cost model. Everything here could have some benefit. And so by putting more categories of things on my plate, there's more benefits I'm able to pull from and accrue. It's actually the wrong way to think about it, because the overhead of all these things also aggregates. And so the more things you bring into your life, the more categories, the more of your time is actually spent managing the overhead of activities, and the benefit you accrue is actually less. And so we have a false model there. So take things off your plate, have filters for what you say yes to, use quotas, and say no definitively. All those things have to come together.
Man, you know what? The quota is so helpful right now. And I experimented with it a bit last year. I get, like you do, I'm sure, a lot of book endorsement requests. And it's just hard. I've made it a rule that I'm going to read every word of every book that I endorse, which means this is probably an 8 to 10 hour commitment, which is huge, right? And you get multiples of those a month. And so I eventually in 2023 shut down and just said, you know what, I'm not doing any more this year, period, which sounds really categorical. And one or two best friends had books coming out and I'm like, yeah, I'll do yours. But I love the quota idea, whether you do that monthly or seasonally, like for the first quarter of the year, I'll endorse 2 books or whatever, and then you see what comes along. That's a great idea. And you're right, no one's going to argue with your quota. For the record, because I know I'm going to get a lot of emails, can I run by the new the filter, the yes filter by you and see if you have any comments? Then we'll get into slow productivity. All right. This is unique to me. I'm not prescribing, I'm describing. So my mission for the next 2 decades, as far as I can see it, is to help church leaders reverse the decline in the church. So question 1, does this help us help church leaders see what they need to do to reverse the decline in the church, whatever request comes in? Now, that's a broad category. Number 2, is this something only I can do? Are there other people who could speak into it better? Are there other people, like if I say no, is someone else just going to step in and they'll get someone else? Number 3, this one's really important for me. It's an obsession over the last year, but are there other A players in the room? Will there be A players in the room? Are these, because I think one of the things I need to do is spend more time with other thought leaders and other people. And if this event gives me that opportunity, then yeah, okay, I think I could do it. And then number 4, a variation. I've heard Seth Godin say this and Tim Ferriss and others. How will I feel the morning this appears in my calendar? Is it still like when I woke up this morning, I'm like, oh, I'm interviewing Cal Newport today. It was like, that's a yes. That's a capital Y yes. But sometimes you look at your calendar and like, I have that meeting. Oh, I have that. So does this help church leaders reverse the decline in the church? Is this something only I can do? Will there be A players in the room? How will I feel the morning it appears in my calendar? What do you think about that?
Those are all good, right?
Okay.
That last one, for example, that's the classic. It's also attributed to Matt Damon.
Okay, Matt Damon.
This was Matt Damon's advice to Ben Affleck too. You have to imagine what you're going to feel the day before. Like I'll give you here's an example. Tell me if this resonates. There was a big book festival happening in the UAE. And you know how like right now in the UAE, they'll spend just endless money on things because they're trying to create like a whole culture of whatever, university and books over there. And so like, hey, here's this invitation. We'll fly you and your wife out there. It'll be super like first class, like really fancy, and you can come to this festival. It's the type of thing when you get that email, you lock in on, oh, it'd be really nice. Like, I haven't been to the Middle East, that part of the Middle East. I haven't been to like the luxury hotels and like, you know, the Emirates Airways is like the best. Like it'd be like a really fancy flight. Like you key on these details that sound cool, which would lead you to be like, yeah, I should do this. But how are you going to feel when you get to that week? You're like, oh my God, I'm about to, you know, lose 4 days to go travel, to talk to an audience that I don't even know if my book's available in that language. And I'm going to have to be on complete time change. And it's like a huge hole in my schedule. And yeah, like those airlines have really cool seats, but like the very best first class airline seat in the world is still like infinitely worse than my living room in terms of comfort or whatever. You know what I mean? You're still in a seat.
You're 100% right.
You're still sleeping. It's like the worst hotel room you've ever had, right? It's a hotel room that you're sharing with someone else. And you can't leave a little area like it. You know, so you think about that, like how's it going to be? And then let me add, so I'm going to riff off of this, especially if we're thinking about church leaders, because I mean, this is an audience I hear from a lot because of deep work. I guess so. Deep work was big among church leaders, and so I talk a lot, especially with like pastors and like Protestant Christians. I hear a lot.
Yeah.
So one of the things that often came up in these conversations too is let's give a fifth idea here about it's not a yes and it's not a no, but it is controlling more the environment in which the yeses are execute so that their footprint is much more reasonable on your schedule. So like a lot of pastors have this issue that they know that serving their flock is part of what they need to do, right? So they can't say, I say no when someone in my congregation wants to talk to me or needs help. That's what I'm supposed to do. But doing this ad hoc whenever these things come in, oh, well, let's just find a time and like get you in or whatever, destroys their ability to be contemplative, destroys their ability to write good sermons, or destroys their ability, like you're talking about, to envision and execute a way to make their church more relevant, to grow their congregation. And so like one of the solutions we would often come up with in these discussions is we control the way in which these conversations happen. Like I do want to help parishioners, but instead of it just being a free-for-all, there's like these office hours where you can like stop by and call. I have these meeting slots that are very easy to schedule, these like 20-minute meeting slots to like come talk to the pastor slots. And when someone is like, hey, I really have an issue, like here's the link, great, grab a slot, like come in, I'll have Zoom on. Like you structure it in a way that you're still helping your congregants, but it's consolidated. It's these days, not those days. It's in the afternoon, not the morning. And it takes very little of your energy from an overhead perspective. And all of your energy is just towards actually connecting and helping the person. So let's make that our fifth category, controlling the circumstances in which a yes is executed so that yes minimizes the damage on other types of things you're also trying to do.
Taking notes. This is fantastic. So one of the other things I think that's a unique challenge is, when I started ministry, there were two big decisions. I had the internet, but it wasn't what it is today. Home phone, church phone, right? And we didn't really have church buildings at the time per se. They were too old to really be functionally useful beyond Sunday. So I had a, quote, church phone that rang in my office in the basement of my house. I was working from home in the 90s. And if that rang after hours, I just let it go to voicemail. And I tried not to give out my home phone too often. Well, cell phones changed the game a few years later. And now, the average pastor might have 12 inboxes. By the time you look at LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram DMs, TikTok, that's not really DMing a lot, but, could be, email, voicemail, texting, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a nightmare where that thing's on 24/7. And most of the pastors I know feel really guilty about not replying on a Saturday when they get a message on a Saturday, or a Thursday night when they get a message on a Thursday night. What advice do you have for them about setting up boundaries and reasonable expectations when it comes to responding to inbound communication?
The general rule here is clarity trumps accessibility. So we think accessibility is what people want, right? In a lot of positions in which there's a client base, be it like congregants or a client for a business, we think what they want is the ability to get in touch with us at any time. What they really want is clarity. How do I get in touch with you and get an answer? So in the absence of clarity, where there's just a bunch of possible incoming channels, there's emails and phones and text, when they want to talk to you, they say, I guess in the lack of any other clarity, I want a response as quickly as possible so that I can take this off my to-do list. Like, okay, Carey, like answer, good. Now we're going to meet then. Great. Now I can take this off my to-do list. But if there's clarity on here is how you reach me for certain things and how the planning process works, as long as it gives them that clarity, it's just as valuable as accessibility. So what this leads to, for example, is what I call cinder filters. I have multiple different incoming communication channels clearly identified. For each, I have a description of what this is for and how it operates. So like, okay, here is my internal email address. This is for internal church business, like working with the staff. That's its own private thing. And the cinder filter there is really clear. This is a Workday work hour type of thing. All right, over here, here's 2 or 3 very specific common things that congregants write me about. I have an incoming for each of those. And some it might be a custom email address. Some it might be some sort of form online. With really clear stuff. Like, okay, so you need to meet with me about something. Here's the channel you go to do that and how this works. Like you send a request here, or even better, it goes right to a planning system where you can choose the thing where you want to talk to me, or there's a description of open office hours. You can stop by one of those. Okay, you have a request here about scheduling a baptism or confirmation. Well, you know what? Here's the incoming for that. And here's how this works. You put your information in here, and we go through this a few times a week. You'll hear back from us. Here's the information we need, et cetera, right? And so what happens is now when someone comes and needs something, instead of just there being like some generic way, they just like, oh my God, I need this or that or this. And I don't know if I'm ever going to hear from you. I just hope you respond to me soon so I can take it out of my mind and just know this got handled. They can pick and choose. This is what I'm wanting to do. Here's how I do it. Oh, I know what's going to happen next, so I don't have to worry about it. Good. Let me move on with the other stuff in my day. I don't need you to get back to me right away about scheduling a baptism, but I need to know that when I'm done with what I'm doing right now, it won't be forgotten. And if I've put my information in a particular form and I know on Wednesday I'll hear back when scheduling happens, that's just as good as you emailing me back right away because it's clarity. So these sender filters, here's how you contact me about X, Y, and Z and what to expect, can serve the same purpose as just I'm always available, but the impact's much smaller.
That's so helpful. Any tips on how you would go about communicating that clearly? Would it be a contact form on your webpage? If you want a pastoral care call, dial here, fill out this form. Or would it be a link tree on your Instagram bio? What specific tasks? I mean, in a small church, put it in the bulletin. That's easy. But if you have a bigger church, what else do you do?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So you want a dedicated web page. Okay. You'll find this. You go to calnewport.com and click on contact. You'll see my page. And there's a list of all sorts of different things. For this, you go here. For this, you go here. For this, go there. For this, here's, whatever. It's all in one page. Then everywhere else that people might think to reach you, you link to that page. So in all of your social media footprint, so if you're engaged on LinkedIn, you're engaged on Facebook or whatever, your bio just says for contact information or whatever, link. Everything points to that page. Bulletin for, contact, scheduling, whatever, go here. And you have this one page where everything points. And that becomes the entryway that anyone has to actually contacting people. And then you have one page to update, one page for all this information. And there's no other side ways around it. Everything. And the great thing about the single page is if someone gets around it, right, they find your personal phone number. You can say like, yeah, happy to talk about it. Here's here you go. You can schedule here. You send in a link. If someone grabs you like in person, like, hey, how do we deal with this thing? Like, should we just can we like just schedule a call while you're here? Whatever. Be like, here's the web page. Like, go on there when you get a chance. Like, everything's spelled out. Everything you need will be on there. I'll show you exactly. We'll get a time, however you want to do it. You can always push people back towards that page.
Yeah, and that can be awkward. I mean, I get the odd DM, hey, I want to be on your podcast, or I want you on my podcast. And we have a form for that on our website.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, as much as I'd love to be able to take this up personally, I know it's going to get lost in the weeds. If you wouldn't mind, you or have someone fill out this form and then it'll get properly dealt with and we'll make sure you're cared for.
Yeah, and that form can have a little explanation of what to expect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, we get a lot of great requests and a lot of awesome guests. We have to be selective around certain things. So like, we may not get back to whatever, right? I mean, I have an email address called interesting@calnewport.com where people send me links, which is really great. It's like I get a lot of ideas for articles from it, but it's super clear. I can't respond to these. Yeah. So like we look at them, me or someone will look at these. We love that you send us links. I can't respond. So if you can write what you want, but I can't respond. And it just sets the expectation. And then people just adjust to that. Like, okay, great. So I'm sending you something. I'm not expecting a response. And so again, clarity goes a long way.
Okay, that is super helpful. Worth the price of admission right there. I hope you just rewind the last 10 minutes and take notes. And of course, we'll have show notes and transcripts as well. But slow productivity. First thing I noticed, Cal, and tell me whether this was just the mood I was in when I read this. This feels like a different book than what you've written in the past. It felt a little more narrative, a little more historical novel, and not so much advice-centric. There's great advice in it, but it felt a little more like reading a hybrid of Cal Newport and David McCullough, and I mean that as a real compliment. You have all kinds of historic stories and examples. Was this a bit of a genre shift for you or style shift for you in writing Slow Productivity?
It was, but it's the subject matter is what I think informed the style. Because, what I was doing here is, okay, so we start, as we talked about earlier, by noting our current definition of productivity is broken. We have the pseudo-productivity nonsense. It's making us all miserable. So what we want to do is come up with a better definition that passes the Cal's 3 kids test. A definition of productivity that allows me to support my family and do work I'm really proud of, and also like spend a lot of time with my kids. Right. Okay. So we need a new definition. Where are we going to find this? I took inspiration from other slow movements. Starting with slow food, but that's expanded to slow cities and slow schooling and slow cinema. All of these slow movements have at their core, go back and study traditional cultures that have spent a lot of time thinking about this and have good ideas. Don't just from scratch try to think up what's a better way to be productive. Go and study traditional cultures. So like slow food says, let's study how our grandparents, our grandparents' grandparents, our grandparents' grandparents' grandparents who lived in this part of Italy, what was their food culture? And let's bring back some of those ideas. So for knowledge work, I said, okay, there are traditional knowledge workers, people who have always worked with their brain to produce things of value out of their head. They were things like artists and writers and philosophers and scientists. And they traditionally had a lot of autonomy, right? I mean, Galileo didn't have another job. Galileo didn't have to do NIH grants. He had patrons and he could just sort of work on it. So they had a lot of space to experiment. What's the best way to sustainably create really great things with your mind when you can completely from scratch invent works? You don't have to have artificial overload or busyness. So I said, I will study traditional knowledge workers as my source of inspiration, and then we'll adapt those ideas to modern jobs that we have today. And so that's why the book is looking at artists. It's why it's looking at philosophers and scientists. These are traditional knowledge workers. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to be very narrative because there's a resonance I think we feel when we hear a story about Georgia O'Keeffe going to Lake George to slow down and find her inspiration. We feel a gut feeling. Yeah, there's something here that is useful and right about how to do this type of work. And I wanted to capture that gut feeling before we then transformed it into, here's what you should do about your email inbox. And so that's why it's very narrative, is that I wanted to swim in the waters of these traditional knowledge workers to rediscover, not create, but rediscover what's the right way to create stuff that you're really proud of without completely drowning in work. So that's what was going on. And also, I'll just say as a side, I've become kind of tired in recent years of the same format in this genre of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania looked at this question and they found that when you primed a user ahead of time with an example, they're 20% more likely. I think people are kind of getting a little bit tired of let's just like go study hunt and cite, assorted random non-replicatable studies as the source of truth. I was like, let's go to our gut. I'm going to tell you a story about Lin-Manuel Miranda working on In the Heights that's going to speak to you at the gut level. It's not me just saying researcher said this. You're going to experience it directly. Wow, there's something aspirational about that story. I agree. I feel it. And then I help you pull out, well, what was that? And if we isolate this principle, how does that apply to your job as a church leader or a CEO? Or, so it's a new approach, but I think the subject matter demanded this approach. It was the right fit for what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It felt like something you could read at the lake house on the weekend or on vacation and not just made you feel guilty about not working. Well, it was enjoyable. You open with the story of John McPhee, and there's a lot of stories about him. But I'm wondering if you, or pick another story that really spoke to you in the book. But again, these are people, some of them are alive today, many of them not, but people whose work endures beyond their lifetime, which I think is the nature of somebody who took a long time to think through an issue, who worked at a more leisurely pace, because I'm not sure fast and great are frequent companions. So do you have a story that is your favorite in the book, or do you want to tell the John McPhee story, or which one, just to sort of just give people a picture of what slow productivity might look like?
Well, I like the McPhee story. I opened the book with the McPhee story.
Yeah.
Because I thought it got at the core of slow productivity. And the whole point of that story was, I said, if you zoom in to the scale of days and watch John McPhee writing, you would say by a modern pseudo-productivity standard, this guy is lazy, this guy barely works. He's the least productive person I've seen. So the book actually opens on him spending an entire week laying on a picnic table in his backyard, looking up at a tree, just trying to figure out how am I going to make this article about the Pine Barrens work? So like you zoom into that week and you're like, this is the laziest guy I've seen. he's laid here.
Just literally lies on his picnic table for 5 days.
5 days.
Yeah.
And you're like, I've been through 1,000 emails in that time and had 7 Zoom calls and hopped on a bunch of whatever. It looks completely lazy. But I said, but this is actually an absurd thing, right? Because if we zoom out and look at John McPhee's career, we're like, oh, this is one of the most productive writers of the 20th century. I mean, he's written something like 18 books. He's won a Pulitzer. He's had 2 other books nominated for finalists for National Book Awards. He's one of the longest running contributors to the New Yorker, where he has this gigantic respected archive. The course he taught at Princeton has trained some of the next generations of the greatest writers. We have David Rimnick, my boss at the New Yorker, took this course from McPhee at Princeton. John Krakauer took this course from McPhee at Princeton. Tim Ferriss, interestingly, took this course from McPhee. Ferriss went to Princeton as well. He says that his favorite thing he ever took was the best writing he ever did this course. So this guy, we look at it from the remove of years and say, oh my God, how productive is he? But when you zoom in, you say, oh, he looks lazy because he's not busy. And I think that captures the disconnect between fast and slow productivity. Like slow productivity is about what you produce over time. You look back on what you've done and said, I've moved the needle. I won a Pulitzer. This was nominated for the National Book Award. I trained a new generation of writers. Like the stuff I did best was great. Fast productivity says, yeah, but are you busy? Like, how was Thursday? Like, why were you doing a lot of stuff on Thursday, right? And so I thought McPhee really captured this, that there is a difference. When you look at productivity on the scale of a day, it leads you to nonsense. When you look at productivity at the scale of a career, it really points towards a much slower, more varied approach to your work. He was really my entryway into articulating what I meant by slow productivity. It was really reading his memoir early in the pandemic, helped me crystallize these ideas that were coming together to help answer my question of how do I produce great work and spend a lot of time with my boys. John McPhee was really my entryway into that. I was like, yeah, you know what? What do we mean by productivity? He's very productive. He had a lot of time for his, he has a lot of time in his life as well. So he's a great entryway. I then end the book on him as well. I come back to him at the end. So he sort of bookends the book.
Yeah, I love to talk a little bit more about doing fewer things and narrowing the scope of your work. So one thing I've discovered in my own life is I thought I was good at so many things when I was in my 20s. And now I realize, it's such a narrow skill set that basically, and again, this was in my personal retreat yesterday, so it's pretty fresh. The ink hasn't dried, but I'm basically a communicator. If you look back to my teenage years, I got started in radio, then I went to law, but I gravitated toward court. And then, my favorite part of my job as a preacher for all those years was preaching. And now I run a communications company doing this. And what is the advantage of zeroing in? Like even you said, your whole portfolio as a professor has now shifted to really make your work more of a synthetic one than, I do my computer science stuff over here and my deep work stuff over there. You're kind of merging into a field of specialization. Can you talk about the value of that over time for the leaders listening?
Well, certainly at the long term, you have to think about skill growing like you would think about money compounding interest. Give skill development enough time. It might start slowly at first, but that interest is going to compound. So if you want to have a proverbial fortune in terms of your ability and its impact, you got to stick with something for a really long time. And there's only so many things you can stick with for a really long time. The more you do, the more you are polluting your time and the less you're able to just stick with something. So for me, I made this decision as an undergraduate. I said, my whole game is computer science and writing. That's my whole game. That's what I'm doing, right? Signed my first book deal as an undergraduate, went straight into the very best computer science grad school in the world out of school. I went right to MIT. This is what I'm doing, computer science and writing. And I just stuck with that. And it took a long time. Like there's these long years, like in my 20s, where I'm at MIT, I'm training, I'm getting better, but I'm also surrounded there by, capital G geniuses, right? So that's difficult. We talk about imposter syndrome, right? There's a professor down the hall who was hired as a professor at MIT at the age of 18. Won his MacArthur at the age of 17. right?
Wow.
Tenured at 21, right? I mean, these were like, ugh. And then writing's really, really hard. I wrote. My books were like, it was fine. They would keep letting me write books, but they were student books. They were paperbacks. Like nothing was really happening. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't my first book is The Tipping Point or whatever. And I just stuck with those things. I don't want to do anything else. That's what I'm going to do. In my 30s, then that started to pay dividends. And now as I hit my 40s, I'm in a really good place with all of those. That's 20 years later. And now I'm really kind of reaping the benefits of like, okay, I can write now pretty well and have a beat on what I'm doing and have painstakingly built an audience. And, I'm a tenured professor with all the flexibility that comes with that. It was just focus on a small number of things. And it wasn't really until the writing and the professorship began to merge more recently that I even thought about something like, let me do a podcast. And that was only, I was like, okay, now as I'm merging those two things, I do think being a writer now in my genre has this other media aspect to it. Like it's not just communicating the written word. So I like very reluctantly and very late added that. And I'll tell you what, check it in 10 years to see how that's going. 10 years from now, I think this commitment to media outside of just written word, 10 years from now, I'll probably really be reaping those benefits. But now I'm just plug, keep it away. So there's a real advantage to doing a small number of things really well, but that requires that you only do a small number of things.
One of the reasons I was attracted to podcasting, people said, oh, you should do a teaching podcast where you teach and just talk on mic. And I'm like, ooh, replicability over the long haul seems very challenging on that issue. So I decided I'm just going to interview the best leaders I know, period, end of sentence. And that is very reproducible. But if you think of the world of a lot of people, we have a lot of communicators listening here. And one of the challenges you have, particularly as a pastor, is you have to get up there every 7 days. So it's the same thing, but it's a different subject, right? Even as a professor, yeah, you've taught this course before. You're going to update your notes from semester to semester, but, it hasn't changed that much. What advice, and one of the trends that's definitely happening, 20 years ago, I was probably preaching 60, 70 times a season, but we didn't have social media times a year. And then it dropped to 35. And that's where a lot of people are now, but still 35 in the world of social media where you're being compared against TED Talks and preachers across town. That's like super, super challenging. Any advice to those who have to create or feel that they have to create new content every 7 days? Thoughts for them?
Right. Well, give it the time it deserves. Make that time regular. So this is when I do it, these 4 days during this time. Don't just wait for the time to come there. Have rituals about what you do in that time. Right. This is how like television shows are produced. Look at a Saturday Night Live schedule. It's day by day. Here's what we do this day versus this day. They've had to routinize the idea of how do we get 90 minutes of original sketch comedy done. It's very structured. This is what we do in each of those sessions. And then add training into the mix. I think we underestimate the value in things that seem like softer skills like communicating versus harder skills like throwing a football. We underestimate the value of specifically training to do the thing better. Training meaning not just I do it a lot, but that I'm pushing myself in specific ways to improve specific aspects of it. Like great speakers, they train, right? They think about it. They study tape, as it were. When they're going up there, they're like, this is what I'm trying this time. I want to work on my body movement. I want to work my pacing and my writing. I want to really think about like, what am I doing? What could I do better in my writing that this person is doing? Oh, interesting. There's a pacing thing I'm not doing. They're doing allusions and callbacks. Let me try that, right? So this constant rhythm of training makes you better. I know this mainly from writing, right? This is how you become a better writer. You train. You don't just write a lot, but you have okay, here's what I'm trying to accomplish with this one. I don't know. Here's a technique I've learned from reading other people who are better than me. Let me work some of that into my writing. Okay, now this is my new challenge. This writer, how do I get to what they're doing? Well, they're doing X, Y, and Z. Let me work that into my writing. So repetition by itself is a slow route to mastery after you get past a certain point of competency. After that, training is what keeps you going as well. So the sense of I am training to be a better speaker when I get up to the pulpit, then you can keep improving. Otherwise, you just plateau. But you just plateau once you get used to it. Like I can write a decent sermon and speak okay. And then I just do that week after week. Then you just plateau. But when you keep studying better speakers and keep adjusting and pushing, and I'm trying this now, I'm trying that now, that's the only way to get continued improvement.
Take a course, hire a coach,
Yep.
listen to other communicators. And just to underscore that, a frequent guest on this podcast is John Acuff. And I always tell John, no one I know works harder, or very few people work harder at becoming better at the skill of communication than he does. And 15 years ago, he had nobody show up for his first ever public talk breakout. And now he's one of the top rated speakers in the United States. Another one that was really interesting, and I think I can say it because it came out publicly, but I had an off-mic conversation with Greg McEwen, Essentialism. And he was talking about studying how you get a standing ovation. And so he referenced that on the Tim Ferriss show. Next time I have him back, we'll talk about it as well. But, they're studying, the best of the best are studying these things during their sermon prep time or development time. They're like, well, I wonder how you do that. So you spend a half hour reading a book, taking a course, studying. It makes you better. Let's talk about working at a natural pace. What do you mean by working at a natural pace?
Well, this is the second principle of slow productivity, and it starts from pointing out what's unnatural about what we do now, which is the invisible factory model. Knowledge workers, people who use our brains, we say we're going to do what the factories did. Here's my shift. It starts at 9, it ends at 5, and I want to be every day, all 8 hours, locked in and executing, right? And it should be every day, every hour, every week, every month. You have some weekends and a couple of vacations in there. That's a really unnatural way to work. Of course, throughout all of human history, it's not the way we worked. Typically, our work was way more varied on many scales. If I'm a hunter-gatherer, it's going to be different. If I'm on a hunt in the middle of the day, we might be resting because the sun is hot. Whereas when we're in the middle of a stalk, it might be really intense. If I'm a farmer in the Neolithic Revolution, the fall and summer is going to be incredibly busy as we're trying to get a harvest in. But January, I have almost nothing going on. It's very varied at different scales. But then factories came along and mills, and we said, no, what's productive here is you just need to work as much as you can. And we invented just regular shifts and constant intensity. When knowledge work came along, we said, well, that's what's the nearest business model that we know is this. Let's just do that. 8-hour workday. But that's a factory shift, and it doesn't apply to cognitive work. Cognitive work is more like agriculture, hunting, and gathering. It demands variation at all sorts of scales. Like what you were talking about in your last book at the daily scale, there's green times versus yellow times versus red times, but there's also even at the seasonal scale, right? Like I'm taking the summer quiet because I really was intensely pushing for 4 months to polish this book. And now I need to recharge the brain here and try to rethink up new ideas and get my motivation back. And then there'll be another busy season. Like we need variation. The invisible factory that we've adopted doesn't allow it. So I'm saying break free from that. We need more variation in pace at all sorts of scales, busy times, less busy times in the day, in the week, in the month, and in the year. The other aspect of that is just changing what we think is reasonable for timescales. Like one of the biggest problems with overload is we just give ourselves not enough time. We say, I want to get this done, and I'm going to get it done in 3 weeks. And we have to scramble to get it done in 3 weeks. Whereas if we said, I'm going to do this in 6 weeks, we wouldn't have to scramble and no one would notice or care. And so I have example after example in the books of people that did great things we think are very productive. And then I zoom in and say, how long did it take them to do this? And it's like years. It's like, oh my God, they took forever to actually finish this. But no one knows that today. They're like, yeah, Lin-Manuel Miranda, I don't know he took 7 years to polish his first play. I just know he had this play and it won all these Tonys, and then he did Hamilton. Or Isaac Newton. Yeah, he wrote the Principia. That's great. It invented calculus and gravity. It took him his whole lifetime. He kept coming to it, coming back. He slowed down. He had all these other interests he was doing or whatever. And so when we zoom out, we don't realize that. So natural pace is variation. Natural pace is also taking longer. Those two things makes work much more sustainable.
I also wonder, I get a lot of books. You get a lot of books. There's some good books, but a lot of it is kind of lighter, superficial thinking. Here's my take, and it feels like a first draft. And I'm really interested in deep thinking. And I think the level of problem that we're dealing with existentially is going to take some rumination. So part of that, not rumination, but contemplation and, thought and deep searching. And I think that gets better over time. What advice would you have for people who are struggling to that kind of off-grid, deep well, really contemplate over multiple seasons to solve a problem kind of thinking that all the examples that you use seem to have been so good at?
Well, I'll first say as an aside, I agree with you as well that a lot of books these days feel like they were, my way of describing it is that there's a lot of writers, especially in pragmatic nonfiction, where they treat writing a book like participating in one of those endurance races, like a Tough Mudder or a triathlon, where it's like this personal challenge. It's hard to write a book. Can I get 60,000 words done? And then the whole book feels like what I always call writing for the sake of writing. Like I can tell the whole second half of this chapter is you just being like, my goal is to get this chapter done this week. What about this? Well, this is kind of relevant. Yeah, let's put in a lot of rhetorical questions in here. And which, it's like I'm training for a triathlon. Like I want to get my miles in this week. And it shows, right? It's not, I've thought this idea through for a very long time. I've built an artifice of understanding around it. And now finally, I am ready with craft to convey this to the world. No, it just feels like, hey, look, everyone, I finished the book, and you see it in the way they talk about their books, about how, for the last 6 weeks, it was all I did all day long is I wrote 8 hours a day. I'm like, okay, I know that book's not going to be good. That's not how you write a book.
True.
You don't just like write 10 hours a day for a month and it's like, okay, I already know that's going to be a problem. Or they talk about how hard it was or how, like, no, it's anyways. So how do you do the opposite? How do you think hard about things for a long period of time? That's trained, I think, is a big piece of this. Is a lot of people say, I'm not comfortable just going analog and thinking deeply. Nothing comes out. I feel really uncomfortable. Maybe I'm just not someone who can do that, which is an absurd conclusion. And I think it's like someone who has never played a guitar. You give them a guitar and they're like, oh my God, I'm terrible at this. I'm not a guitar player, guys. I've seen people play. Have you seen Eric Clapton play the guitar? He's way better than me. He's a guitar person. I didn't get anything like that. No, you say you haven't practiced. It's going to take you a while to get good at it. Cogitation is the same way. You have to actually practice thinking. You have to practice contemplation. We know this from a religious context, right? When it comes to contemplative traditions, prayer traditions, monastic traditions, what do you see there is that there's an incredibly structured approach to prayer and thinking that is meant to help initiate and teach someone how to use their brain in this particular internal facing way. Right? You need a lot of structure and training and liturgy and practice. And then over time, your brain learns, in this case, how to be internal, how to find, they use the Hebrew term kavana, that actual like connection to God through prayer. It's practiced. So we're used to it in that context. It's the same when we're talking about professional cogitation. So you have to just get used to it. All right, what I'm doing now is just like a 30-minute walk a few times a week, no phone, just thinking about a problem. And let me just do that for a while, until my mind's not just completely bouncing around, squirrel, 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 shiny car. I'm getting kind of more comfortable with that. Now let me try, I'm going to the coffee shop for 2 hours and I'm bringing a notepad and I'm going to work on an idea. And at first it's uncomfortable. Let me do that until I'm comfortable at it, right? This could be a whole season's work just to get to the place where I can go to the coffee shop for 2 hours and like work on a problem with pen and paper. But you're building up facility with thinking and what it feels like, how to use your mind's eye, how to load up these relevant semantic networks in your brain and pull from them without being how to suppress the distracting networks. It's practiced. So I always argue to people, thinking is the thing that it's our superpower as a species. We can think and it can be incredibly powerful, but we got to train it. You got to harness that power. And that does take practice.
I've sort of made a new resolution in my life over the next 20 years to go deep. When the world is going shallow, the answer is go deeper. And one of the first things I had to do last summer, I realized I lost my ability to read like an actual book, because I was skim reading. And it wasn't that I didn't know what the letters meant. Of course, I know how to assemble letters into, something that makes sense. It was that my attention was so divided. And so I picked a book to read from cover to cover in a week, and I did it. And I worked my way up from 2 pages without being distracted to whole chapters without being distracted, to the point where a few months later, reading became enjoyable again. And I guess that's the kind of training you're talking about. I'd love to. You talk about obsessing over quality, but it does seem to me like the world is getting faster and shallower, and quality is harder and harder to come by. Any closing thoughts, Cal, on the importance of quality in our work?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that culture is getting shallower, but it doesn't mean the economy is getting shallower. Culture is getting shallower because of particular technological trends. Those trends are pushing us towards shallowness because it makes profit for those companies. So it's a bit of a mirage because we're like, well, we're on the internet all the time and all this information's flying around and we can jump around to all these things, that this means somehow that what's valuable in the economy has shifted towards that. No, it hasn't. Short attention span type of social media, TikTok, that exists because for the small number of investors in those companies, it's an incredibly profitable proposition. But it has nothing to do with what actually creates value for you or what actually creates value in the world. TikTok is very fast. But for 99.999% of the population, being really fast on TikTok is going to have no impact on your economic viability or supporting yourself or having an impact on the world. So you have to, in some sense, be a contrarian and say, I am going to walk a different path than this always on, shallow, digitized hyperspeed path. And I'm going to focus on doing things that matter really well. I'm going to come back to those things again and again. And I'm not going to worship at the altar of busyness, nor am I going to procrastinate. I'm going to embrace slow productivity, working on the stuff that matters at a reasonable pace and increasingly trying to improve my taste, improve the level I'm trying to push myself, trying to improve the impact of what I produce, but do that in an environment of not doing too many other things. Do that in an environment with variation on pacing and the comfort in taking longer. I'm convinced this is a sustainable path. You can produce stuff that matters. And when you produce stuff that matters, you don't just change the world, but you're rewarded, not just financially, but in terms of flexibility and autonomy and how you live your life. It allows you to tap into our instinct for accomplishment while also tapping into all the other parts of life that are important. So in the end, right, we're not rejecting productivity, but we're redefining it. And when we make it something slower and built around quality and these other ideas, I think then we have a template that, even though it feels different than everything we're hearing in the culture, we have a template for a life that I think is much more deep and meaningful and sustainable.
I'm very, very intrigued by that path and more committed every year to walking it. And, you've said this, I think Nir Eyal has said it, but in the attention economy, the ability to focus, the ability to do deep work really is a superpower. And I think it's what people are actually hungry for. I don't think they're hungry for another, 30 seconds of some coach yelling at them on TikTok or Instagram about how to buy crypto or real estate or actualize their lives or what they should eat or not eat. I think that's symptomatic of a much deeper hunger. And so, Cal, I see as an ally, I see as a mentor. I really, really appreciate your work. And I think slow productivity, the subtitle is The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout, is just such a needed message. So thank you for your contribution to the space that so many of our listeners and myself are in. Appreciate you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, it's been riveting. Any final thought, parting word before we go?
Well, I guess I should say, I don't use any social media, but if you're interested in these ideas, I do have a podcast, Deep Questions. That's the one we talked about. Mm-hmm. And we set up a website, calnewport.com/slow, where we have the first, I guess the introduction of the book is there with the McPhee story. So if you want to go deeper on the McPhee story, calnewport.com/slow, I got permission to put that up. So you can go read that right away.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And if you're wondering why Cal doesn't have social media, just read Digital Minimalism if you happen to be someone who missed that book.
That will answer that question. Yep.
You've been successful without it. Like, it is possible, right? It totally is possible. So Cal,
it is. Yeah. And so read that book too, if you feel like, especially if you're a church leader that feels like somehow your church is going to go under if you're not on TikTok, read Digital Minimalism, because TLDR, it won't. We'll leave it there.
Cal, thank you so much.
Thank you.